Hello everyone, my name is Adam Cook. This is Theology 605, I think it is. We are going to be talking about the question of is it moral to participate in actions labeled as terrorist activities? This is my topic for our final project for Foundations of Moral Theology. We're trying to put in a lot of the concepts that we've learned throughout the past semester into this. So that we can kind of get a more well-rounded understanding of the question. But what is the importance of the question? Why does the question need to be asked in the first place? I think that one of the issues is that in our current system, terminologies like terrorism is just kind of thrown out there, and it's not really there's not really a lot of concreteness into what it actually means. There's like several different definitions. There's a U.S. legal definition. There's like an international definition. There's an immigration definition for the United States. So there's a couple different definitions of what terrorism actually is. For some groups, Christian groups in the Middle East or in other places, who feel like they need to respond back, or who may participate in what legally would be defined as terrorism within a U.S. legal definition. We have to ask the question of, is their soul in moral jeopardy? Are they committing moral sin by participating in these so-called terrorist activities? And that's kind of the question and kind of the importance of this question. We really need to get to the root of not only what is terrorism, because, there's several definitions of that, but we need to come up with one universal definition. But also, is it immoral to participate in activities that would be labeled as terrorism by like the U.S. or the international organizations, etc. So that's the importance of the question, and we'll go into more detail about that. We are going to talk about three articles, one by Theodore Cito, one by Colin Flint and Ghazi Walid Fallah, and another one by C.H.A. Cody. And all three of these authors are secular. They're not Catholic or anything, but they are secular. And they do really ask the question of what is terrorism and just war. That's kind of like where it kind of all begins. Begins with just war, and then it kind of builds up. So we'll really get into like just war theory a little bit in the Colin Flint and Ghazi Walid Fallah article. But let's kind of go ahead and jump into it. The first article we're going to talk about is actually by Theodore Cito, and he wrote an article called "The Morality of Terrorism." Pretty self-explanatory name, right? He asked the question of, is it moral? Is terrorism moral? And what is terrorism? And he gives a definition. The definition that he gives is the killing, disruption, or destruction of something of value for political purposes by someone other than a government or its agents acting covertly. So for Cito, we're going to see one primary point, broken down into two smaller points. The first point is that he determines terrorism is determined by state actors who are holders of structure. So basically he states that governments cannot participate in terrorist activities because governments or states hold the social structure together. So it is because the state holds that social structure together that anything they do cannot be wrong. And he goes into two primary points into this. The first point that he makes is he says that the difference between covert organization and terrorist organizations is that covert organizations are working for a state actor, and therefore are being initiated by the state for the defense of the entity and of the state and of the people and the social structure. Whereas non-state actors or terrorist organizations are not. So they're not acting in the best interest of the entity. Therefore, because they have deferred away from the social structure, the state has a right to attack and to defend itself and to force the group, the terrorist organization, back into that social framework that it came out of. And two, that world powers set the tone for who is labeled a terrorist. So this is one of the things that he himself points out, is that the term terrorist cell organization is actually labeled by world powers. It's not something that's labeled out by, let's say, the non-state actor. The non-state actor has no say within the international system. And that's the reason why in political science we get this great terminology called one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And we kind of see this going on today with ISIS and other groups. They are doing very similar things. They are participating in activities we might label as terrorism, but to some groups inside the Middle East, they're not terrorists. They are defending their homeland, and we'll get more into that a little bit later. So those are the two primary points that you really need to. That's the primary summary of his entire article, and two primary points of what he has to say, and we'll look into that a little bit later. The second one that I'd like to talk about is by Colin Flint and Ghazi Walid Fallah. And their article is called How the United States Justifies Its War on Terrorism, Prime Morality, and the Construction of a Just War. And Colin Flint and Ghazi Walid Fallah really get into the roots of just war theory. And that's one of the reasons why I chose this article, is because just war is the basis for most of your modern definitions of terminology. It's the very basic piece where kind of it all comes off of. So you have just war, and then you have these other snippets of determination of morality because of that. So, and just war is, by the way, a Catholic doctrine, just for your personal information. And so they're going to define it a little bit differently. They're going to actually define it based off of the terminology of just war. And basically they say that terrorism cannot be self-defense, it cannot be a preeminent self-defense, and it cannot be in the aid of a victim of someone else's attack. So terrorism, if it's a terrorist activity, okay, you're not going to be in defending yourself. You're more offensive than you are defensive. And you're not going to be attacking to stop or to stop a future attack. And you're not aiding a victim of someone else's attack, in which you are, someone else is a victim, so you go in and you jump in and save them. That's not kind of like how this plays. That's not how that works. So basically, the summary of their entire article focuses instead on the U.S. justifying its interaction within the Middle East by destroying territorial boundaries. So, Saudi Arabia has a boundary, Israel has a boundary, Iraq has a boundary, Iran has a boundary. The United States instead has invaded, and this is their first minor report, has invalidated all of those state boundaries by claiming self-interest in defending itself from non-state actors, primarily its interests. And you see this inside of U.S. foreign policy. They say, oh, well, we're fighting for our U.S. interest. U.S. interest abroad, okay, is usually the terminology that you'll see. And that's how they're justifying, going into Iraq, going into Afghanistan, going into all these different countries, because they're saying that they're doing it for self-defense because their interests are on the line. So we see the basic foundations of just war. And the second point that Colin Flint and Ghazi Walid Fallah, that's so much fun to say, by the way, Ghazi Walid Fallah, is that the U.S. role as a hegemony allows it to distort the moral field, primarily the term of terrorist. So we kind of see this similar concept that we saw with Theodore Cito, in that even the United States as a hegemonic power, hegemonic meaning the number one power in the world, who maintains 50+1% of all power inside of the entire world on the global scale, has the right to determine who is and who is not a terrorist, because they can influence their cultural and societal influences more greatly throughout the entire world than other people. So they have that right as a hegemonic power. And you kind of see that, again, it's kind of, correlating a little bit with Theodore Cito, but one of the primary differences is that, Colin Flint and Ghazi Walid Fallah do not actually say whether or not it is a state or non-state actor that can actually, join inside of terrorist activities. They're basically just saying that the United States uses just war and the just war theory to justify its activities in the Middle East, which is basically what we saw with Theodore Cito. So kind of like reinforces that idea, but instead of looking at, Cito kind of goes into like consequentialism and some other philosophical moral thought, but primarily, Colin Flint and Ghazi Walid Fallah primarily just stick with just war theory, which is, in my personal opinion, a little bit better. But we'll get into that. And then the last article we're going to talk about is C.A.J. Cody. And he wrote an article called Terrorism, Morality, and Supreme Emergency. And that's important. It's a very important article. In general, it kind of does have some influence of how I kind of see the topic. But again, we'll get into that. So Cody gives us the definition that, and this is also his thesis. All these definitions are their thesis. They base the whole paper around this. Cody says, the organized use of violence to attack non-combatants as innocents in a special sense, or their property for political purposes, is terrorism. So he claims that both state and non-state actors can participate inside of terrorist activities. So it doesn't mean that if a state attacks its own people, that it's not morally wrong. Okay, if excessive use of force is used, then it is still morally wrong. But the big thing that he really claims is that moral exemptions can apply, which, as someone who we've just studied, the entire, we've just been studying Catholic moral teaching. It sounds very similar, but don't be fooled. Okay, it's not like what some of the things that we've learned, where circumstance, intention, object come into play. It's nothing like that. Okay, basically, it's okay. I would probably lean it more towards proportionalism than anything else. As long as you have a commensurate reason for doing the activity, then you're good to go. You're let off the hook. It's not morally wrong for you. He kind of takes away moral absolutes. That's one of the things that I don't like about what he does, and it is a bit of a problem. He completely just dismisses all ideas of moral absolutes and falls more into subjectivism instead of objectivism and decided that particular point. But like I said, so his first primary point in that is that state actors can participate in acts of terrorism when it uses excessive force against non-combatants. So we think about, sometimes we see in the Middle East, these videos where like citizens are being beat to death, or that would be excessive force. Cody would label that as an act of terrorism. And then, of course, his second point is that some actions are morally permissible due to extreme circumstances. Basically, gets right back into what we were just talking about with how we kind of learned about proportionalism with commensurate reason. It's kind of like that. He kind of goes more into like state of emergency, so which is a completely different philosophy that honestly we don't really need to pay attention to. It's not that important, but for the circumstances of this project, I think it's important to understand that he does allow exemptions in extreme circumstances. Otherwise, there's not really an exemption. You don't really get an exemption out of that. So going into my point, I would like to go ahead and lay out my thesis. My thesis is this: it is not always immoral to participate in activities labeled as terrorist. And I give two reasons for this. One, cultural invasion due to globalization would, along with the drone strikes on innocent towns, which we know happen all the time, would necessitate that those who join terrorist organizations for the defense of homeland do not commit an immoral act, because they're acting inside of self-defense. If we look at it from an Aquinas perspective, okay, they are in essence they are acting in self-defense. They're not trying. Their intention is not to kill Americans in cold blood. That's not their intention. Their intention is to protect their homeland, who they see as being invaded by Western drones and Western attacks. Naturally, people are going to flock because their homes are being destroyed. It's a common sense thing. It's natural. Using natural reason, that's what you're going to do. If your house is getting attacked by a bunch of people who don't live in your country, you're going to join a cause to be able to stop them. That's called self-defense. And two, hegemonic influence or the power of Western entities to determine who is a terrorist does not delegitimize a revolutionary group or those individuals acting out of self-defense. So while the U.S. legal definition may in fact, put the Boston Tea Party as a terrorist activity, we would say, and I would say rather, that it is not a terrorist activity, that it is revolutionary in that basic human rights are being discriminated or being taken away, and therefore the people have a right to rebel. We read that in the Constitution, don't we? Provide for the common good, provide for the common defense. Those were all basic principles of the reason why this country was founded. And because those principles were being taken away by the British, we revolted. And we did what we did, using